Hello, hello. Good evening from another Open Security Mini Summit sessions. Today is the first day of Mini Summit in January 2021, and we still cannot believe we have left 2020 behind. Anyway, this is the second session on threat modeling today. So thank you guys for joining the previous one as well. If you missed it, it's already on our YouTube channel. You can check it out. And this one, it's more going to be about categorization and pitfalls, what not to do, and how to do things better. And James will be taking us away. And as you know, this is an interactive session, so you guys can ask questions anytime you want. James.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Myself? Yeah. I am Didar. I do risk management, but I am really obsessed about DevSecOps and AppSec. So threat modeling is a very passionate subject for me.
I'm James Bohr, and if you've heard the phrase, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you could probably just assume that all I have is threat modeling, because I think it can be applied almost anywhere. So I'm a bit religious about it. I do know other things as well, but mostly threat modeling is my bag. So threat categorization is probably worth kicking off with what threat categorization is within threat modeling. It's a particular approach, and feel free to disagree with me. People are allowed to disagree, but it's a particular approach used with things like Stride, Linden, security cards, OWASP cornucopia. If you want to use the OWASP top 10 for threat modeling, you're doing threat categorization. It's the aspect of it where you are categorizing the threats, inventorying through them to determine what they are, and then you can take them on and determine risk and which ones you want to resolve. And before it, you are saying, here are the overarching threats. So it's what attacks are those threats going to use, what motivations might they have. And there's a number of methods for doing it. Does anyone want to do their own take on what threat categorization is? Or shall I jump into some of the ways it gets used in practice with things like Stride?
Anybody? Anybody wants to share their view? Or anything to add so far?
I'm going to assume not. If we take Stride then, because it is probably the best known threat modeling system out there, the categories in Stride are spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. There's another variant of it called Striped, which is exactly the same but adds privacy. There's other forms such as Linden, where you're looking at linkability, identifiability, that's more privacy, but it's still those categories. And the categories are usually in every system I've come across which has them used as little more than a brainstorming aid. So since we've got pitfalls in the title, I'll just go through the pitfall that I have seen and come across multiple times, which is where you have the 4-hour debate over, well, is that tampering, or is that information disclosure, or is that spoofing? And my view is that it doesn't matter, because it's better just to get the threat down or get the attack down and start dealing with it than get it exactly right in the taxonomy. But other people do feel differently. So I guess then I'm going to open a question up to try and get some conversation going. Is threat categorization important? Is it something you're using? What are your thoughts on it?
I think it would be important to scope.
Could you elaborate on that a bit? Because I'm interested there.
The problem I have in threat modeling is keeping my mind in control, and that depending on this is in properly scoping the work. If I have a client that is interested in X, Y, and Z, then I'm trying to keep my work sort of confined in that lane is somewhat difficult, and I think probably threat categorization would help me do that.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, let's be honest, creativity works best when you've got some sort of constraint. Otherwise, you're just doing blue sky thinking and you get lost in clouds. So is that the type of thing you're talking about, that you're saying, here is the scope, here's the areas I'm focusing. Yes, I've got huge freedom within that, but at least I'm not worried about aliens attacking. I don't know why I keep going to aliens with threat modeling at the moment, but I do. Sorry.
That was the exact example I had in mind, was the alien attack example.
Yeah, I keep on going to that for the last couple of weeks, so I don't know if something's trying to tell me something and we should all start building bunkers. But yeah, no, I can definitely see the whole keeping a realistic attack. Is there a risk that with those categories you leave out something important? So if we take stride and striped, striped is just stride with privacy added. Is there a risk that if you care about privacy and use stride, you'll overlook it? Is that potential pitfall?
Could be.
That's a good question. For some reason, I keep thinking of quantitative risk management. And I don't know why. It's like that bad song in the summer.
You can probably see it on the bookshelf behind me.
It's blurred, we can't see.
But I guess it really depends on what your goals are. If and again, it comes down to client requirements.
Yeah.
Yes, you will always. I mean, you have to sort of accept you will not be able to boil the earth. You will always miss something, and you have to sort of accept that, because you have to remind your customers of that. And so I'm reminded of the example of a person who has a safe in their house, and they've got, all the appropriate doors and locks and maybe even double glazing. But the idea here is that in a particular case in Los Angeles, attackers were using chainsaws to go through walls. So yes, the threat model missed that.
Understandably, actually, I've occasionally used a sledgehammer through a door as an example of where threat models focus on building a better lock when you need a reinforced door, but I don't think I've ever really considered chainsaws as a potential attack vector for house burglary.
My favorite is the suspended ceiling in the office.
Yeah, crawling through there. I mean, when I'm doing threat modeling and I have free reign over what to use, I tend to go for the Parkerian hexad because it's fairly atomic, but it is also very broad, so it doesn't bring those constraints, and it relies a lot on the people involved in it knowing what type of attacks those categories might contain and being able to translate it. Whereas with something like, if we take stride as a middle ground where it's reasonably specific about the categories of attacks, and then something like the ENISA threat taxonomy or MITRE attack framework as a very specific categorization. So there you've got very strongly guided thought processes. Or in fact, we could say the OWASP top 10. That's saying these specific 10 are the ones you need to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Is there a factor related to the target? Does the target feed into the attack vector or the threat vector? It
should do always, because there should be a two-way thing. You can't just say, I'm going to take the OWASP top 10 and I'm building an on-premise application and I will apply the OWASP top 10 for it. Oh, look, none of them apply, so I'm secure.
That makes sense.
Anyone else? I think we're just brainstorming, discussing, seeing what happens. Otherwise, I'm going to go and get one of my decks of threat cards and start playing solitaire.
Do you use those cards for threat modeling?
I use them to guide brainstorming. I use them to teach threat modeling in person. I don't use them myself to do threat modeling because I've been doing it so long that they're all stuck in my head anyway. But I do use them to teach threat modeling and help prompt conversation around it. So particular topics and particular types of attack. And then you've got with EOP, for example, or cornucopia, invent your own attack cards within this category.
So how effective do you think the gamification ones, like the cornucopia and
Right.
elevation of privilege, are?
I'm going to let someone else answer first because I've been talking too much and I don't want to talk over everyone.
So Petra, Denise, do you guys use it at Glasswall?
I don't think we got a card, actually. I don't think. Petra, have you seen it, the cornucopia stuff?
No, we haven't used it.
Is there a version that's completely online? Did somebody mention that earlier today?
Apparently the elevation of privilege one has a version that is completely online, which is good.
Yeah. Cornucopia doesn't. Security cards doesn't have it. So cornucopia has the croupier, which will deal cards, but you have to have your own deck to use it remotely. Security cards doesn't have anything. Adversary cards are obviously all PDF. There's no physical decks of them yet, but I'm sure Mark will get around to that at some point.
I'm not familiar with the security cards you're mentioning.
Security cards are, let me just find the link. So security cards are an interesting one because they are a threat categorization or threat library, really, if we want to be honest about it. But they are higher level, more human focused than either the cornucopia or EOP.
Okay.
So in the chat, there we go. So the attack vectors they include, because none of these things are really talking about threats, they're talking about attacks that threats will use, are things like access or convenience, inside knowledge, various other bits, and you use them to build up a threat. So unlike others, you are constructing a threat from them with motivations, resources, methods, and impact. So you could build a profile out of that, which is similar to Mark's adversary cards. But yeah, I'm not quite sure how to explain that one. I can say how I used it when I was doing research on it, which was using them to build a threat, and the people doing it, because of the research I was doing, found it quite a clunky way to do it, but I can see it would be valuable.
I see. So,
did you mention another one, James, or is it just me?
Let's see, I've mentioned adversary cards, security cards. There's another deck of security cards which are different, but sorry?
I'm not familiar with the adversity. How did you say your name was?
Adversary cards.
Adversary cards. Can you tell me a bit about those as well? I'm not familiar with it as well.
Yeah, they were developed by a guy called Mark Miller, and they actually came up at the last, was it the last summit now?
Summit,
2020, yes. We counted the last summit. So they came up there and he ran a session on them. But if you've come across persona non grata or abuse cases where you've got the attacker profile, it's a similar thing to that. So it's a deck of cards where you have a name for the attacker, a funny little picture, a bit about the tactics and tools they might use, a bit about their motivation, and that's it. And as silly as it sounds, that is the whole idea behind persona non grata as well, except with PNG, what you're doing is building up a more profile-y profile. So you'll use an actual snapshot of someone, you'll give them an actual name, you will say, this person wants to break into our system because they're a disgruntled employee. They know about these systems, they know about this, they are willing to do this, or this person hates our way of life and wants to just cause that, and so on. So the aim of that type of thing, which I think I keep on going on about being the most important part of threat modeling and the most often overlooked when you get to technical, is to get the idea of who is the threat. Because the threat isn't ransomware, the threat isn't SQL injection, the threat isn't cross-site scripting. Those are attack vectors. The threat is the person doing that, the person who writes the ransomware and tries to deploy it against you. And the moment you've got realistically the threats that target you, going back to what Garth said earlier, you are then constraining it down. So you're not worrying about the aliens. You are worrying about the ransomware authors out there. You're worrying about the people who carry out invoice fraud, so the fraudsters. You're worried about organized crime. In certain areas, you will have others out there as well. So whether that's actually threat categorization, and most of what we talk about as threat categorization is attack categorization, is probably getting into philosophy.
Yeah, let me just paste the link. I just found the video.
Yeah.
So
For the adversary cards.
yeah.
Cool. I was just going to do that. Thank you.
So I'm sure that was a presentation, but she does want to. There's the video, and there were some pretty cool cards, right? That we had at the time that were created. I put screenshots here. I'll actually probably share the screen, and actually I'll share my screen, and then James, you can provide some more context.
Yep.
So this is, for example, some of the cards that we created, right?
Yeah, that's some of them. I mean, Evil DevOps is one of my favorites there because that is a very distant threat, but it's still a person behind it. So that's the people designing the botnets, designing the custom ransomware. Sadly, I don't think we have one of my favorites, which is the social engineer, but we've got Shadow Me there, who I believe follows people through doors. So the point is you make it human, and I generally argue that the huge advantage of making it human, as well as making it realistic, is that we are very, very good at understanding and predicting what other humans will do. We're extremely bad at predicting what technology will do because it's not intuitive, but other humans, we're great. So if you work out what the other humans will do, you can then say, and they might use these technologies to do it, and it does help to bring in that constraint.
And these cards, there are also the innocent or inadvertent actors as well, like someone who doesn't know where they're clicking.
Is there the, no, there's not the negligent getter in there, is there? The one who just uploads everything to GitHub and doesn't bother to secure it.
A question from your last comment there. Have you used it, and what's your thoughts on using personas to qualify potential adversaries on a threat modeling session? Would you think there would be value in something like that? No, or have you used this already?
I always use that to kick off a threat modeling session or to kick off a whole threat modeling process. I think it's probably the most important thing to start with. Dida's been on my class. She knows exactly how I feel about it. I don't know if other people use it. I do know some do. I suspect some don't, and I suspect some would disagree with me and say that the person behind it isn't the important bit. But I do.
If you use, I'm assuming you have a diagram of the application or software that you're threat modeling against, and you would have already some personas, or is that something that you would start to build in the team?
So if I'm in a perfect world, when I'm doing threat modeling, and I've got close to that a few times, I would say start coming up with the personas well before you've started any technical design work. So coming up with the personas is where you are dragging in the product owner, the project initiation team, and the project board and saying, okay, you've got this idea for a project, you've got 3 sentences, let's look at who might threaten that, who might target that, given our profile, given the aims of the project. Because you don't need the technical side to work out the humans behind it. But then that informs the model when you do get down to the more technical stuff. So you can just do that straight into part of the design and say, if we're doing this and we've got that type of adversary, or we've got that type of potential negligent threat out there, we need to consider this as part of the design. So it informs your requirements.
And and that's the kind of thing that you will scale, right? So you only have to do it once, because from other companies, well, at least, well, it depends on the size of the company, right? But you should be able to scale that, because the next threat models, you already have that base.
Yeah, so you've got those threats ready to go. You've got those profiles ready to go. You might want to add in another one or remove one, but the bulk of them are threats against the company, not threats against the project. They are only threats against the project because the project is run by that organization.
Is there like a methodology or framework that takes the threat actors into consideration?
There are things like PNG, persona non grata, which does to a degree, but it doesn't then go on and follow them through. I've yet to come across a single method which takes them into account along with the technical side, and I suspect that's because there's no point doing that. You take the human threat model and you use that to guide later threat modeling, but directly integrating it across, unless you are doing something like going, here's an APT group I think will attack, they use these tactics and therefore I will worry about these tactics, which would be an interesting approach, but carries the risk that APT groups change tactics. You can get very focused on a particular person when you're better taking a step back and having a slightly wider view. And most importantly, if you protect against one APT group and another one hits you, it's, you know, completely different methods. So you can get too focused on what they're doing. But yeah, I don't know of one that actually takes it all the way through. It's more a mishmash of different methodologies.
Great. What else?
I keep on hoping someone's going to disagree with me, because I do feel like I'm talking too much for an interactive session.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you, James, but I just want to kind of put something out there. Like, I just want you to kind of say, what do you think it's the benefit of the cards itself? Like you said, okay, it's important to identify, you know, the threat actors, you know, like who are the people who are going to be threatening my organization. Where do you think these cards come in? Because they can be quite specific, as I saw. Do you think are they more to kind of apply to the psychology, to the people that you're trying to present this, or is it something else that you had in mind? That why start off with those cards?
So do you mean the adversary cards?
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily start with the adversary cards.
Okay.
I would probably build my own profiles. But
okay.
The advantage of the adversary card, same as something like elevation of privilege, same as something like the OWASP top 10, same as if you happen to have infinite resource and time, looking at the National Vulnerability Database and taking that as your threat library. It's a way to give people the information without them needing to have the experience or have done the research into it. So it's a very accessible way for people to start doing threat modeling. And I have a huge thing about, I would much prefer someone to build an absolutely awful, incomplete threat model with 3 or 4 threats than not build one at all. So long as it's going down the right lines and there's something useful coming out, the people building it have gained some experience. They have improved security, probably for very little effort. And the next time they'll do it better. So the cards are mostly a tool to aid people in doing it and learning about it, to my mind.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they're a great way to gamify these things.
And, you know, the elevation of privilege cards, the same thing. They do not, and cornucopia, they do not have every single threat that you need to care about. They might have no threats you need to care about, but you can throw them in and you can then use them, and it prompts the people doing the threat modeling. It means they've got something to start with. What I have tended to find is that the cards often get abandoned.
Yeah, I think you know, to really make it stick, you sort of want to make it relevant to a company, right? You want to make it relevant to whatever space you are, right? So, you know, you also take into account some of the maturity things, right? So, for example, as the company evolve, there's threats that after a while you go, well, that's not necessarily a problem, right? Because, you know, we already got that under control. It's, you know, fundamentally a lot of this is also about, you know, guiding the developers to thinking about the threats that are relevant to them, right?
Yeah.
Which is also going to be exciting for them, right? Because that's in context, right?
Everyone likes thinking like an attacker. It's more fun, and that's what you're really doing. Yeah, no, Andre in the chat, you're absolutely right. Stride as written is purely technical impact or purely technical vulnerabilities. If you combine it with Dread, there is a degree of business impact, but it isn't really clearly mapped across to that. Mainly because Dread includes number of users affected, or affected users, I think they phrase it as, but that's more on the prioritization side. So yeah, there is, if you're looking at most of the technical threat models out there, I'm just trying to think if any of them are different. Linden has a degree of privacy impact. I don't think any of the others really consider business impact or wider impact beyond technical, beyond this gets compromised. So that doesn't weigh into the prioritization most of the time.
I don't think I actually came across Linden before, James.
Linden is it's a privacy-focused threat modeling method. So it is a set of categories again. If you think almost exactly along the lines of Stride, except instead of a data flow diagram, you are looking more at a data model. So you're not caring about where the data is being shuffled, you're caring about what it's being stored in most cases. And I can never remember all of them, but let me just remind myself it's out there. So it's another acronym-based method, and it is, here we go, linkability. Can the information be linked together? Identifiability, is it inherently identifiable? Non-repudiation, can someone access it without being caught, or could they deny accessing it? Detectability, can you detect someone accessing it? Disclosure of information, can it be disclosed? Unawareness, and non-compliance. So it's again just an acronym, and you build up your diagram or build up your list, and then you iterate through the acronym and say what linkability threats are there, what identifiability, non-repudiation. So it's, in a way, it's nothing special. It is a take very similar to Stride, but with a completely different angle because it is purely privacy focused. Oh, and there is a game called Linden Go, which is the card version of Linden, because everyone has to have a card game now.
And we had a session of Linden in the actual summit this year, I think. I'm trying to find the video link to it.
Yeah, I think I remember we did a couple of sessions on it. So, but if you go back to the categorization, right, and you know, I think the thing about is the more you can make it relevant to the target audience, the better. Right.
I think there's two parts of it. Not only the more you can make it relevant, that's a brilliant thing to do. But if the target audience have less experience, the more information you can feed into them, even if that constrains their thinking more. So, you know, moderate experience, maybe you just go with Stride, here's your categories. Less experienced, you throw in the EOP cards.
Yep. Because a lot of these things is about making people think, right? It's like, I never thought of that. Ooh, that's quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the whole aim of it, is just making people think through what the threats might be. I often boil it down to about a 10-second summary of threat modeling. What threatens my system? how does it threaten my system? What will go wrong if it achieves what it wants to? There you go. That's threat modeling.
Yep. What can go wrong? What am I building, right?
But the categorization helps guide it. And I think there probably is an argument that categorization gets less important as you develop more experience in threat modeling.
Well, but that's just because you're categorizing almost by default, right?
Yeah, you're instinctively doing it because you've been through them so many times. I mean, the categories I do always fall back on anytime I'm asked to just do a quick threat modeling like party trick live threat model are the hexad, because I've yet to find anything that can't fall under one of them. They're nicely abstract where they need to be, but you can go down to technical with them if you need to.
Yeah.
And actually, for anyone who doesn't know about the hexad, because I didn't realize how little known it was, everyone knows about the CIA triad. You've got confidentiality, integrity, availability. The Parkerian hexad adds 3 more attributes, which are authenticity, utility, and the other one that I always forget, possession and control, or possession or control. So the idea is you've got those 6 properties, and if I'm threat modeling quickly and without any aids to hand, I will generally just run through those 6 as my categories.
Could you share that name again
Yeah.
in the chat?
I'm just pulling up the Wikipedia link for it. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay.
I couldn't find the session on Linden. I'll find it later. I shared in our Slack channel.
So it was, what we're covering, it was pitfalls. Pitfalls are generally going down a dead end or getting overly specific when you don't need to. I mean, any others? Any pitfalls? Any other use cases? Anyone actually used any of the other card decks, or will use them, or used profiles, or tried to use the International Vulnerability Database for threat modeling? Because I think VAST does something along those lines.
I guess especially when you use tools, right? The problem is that when they try to follow that stuff, they come up with a spectacular list of issues.
Yeah. Yeah, you go down the same route as vulnerability scanning, except you've not got anything to test. So you get a huge number of issues to fix. But since you can't fix them all, you can end up just wasting effort or spending far too much time on prioritization. Excuse me, speaking of threats, I just need to go save a desk from 2 cats.
I like the soundtrack.
Yeah, she wasn't happy about being pulled off from the paper she was trying to eat.
Show us the cat? Show us the cat.
I would, but she's gone under the desk now.
Yeah, not impressed.
No, not at all.
Protector.
Okay.
So speaking about tools then, in a lot of ways, some of the pitfalls I find in relate to ways of working, in that depending on the scope of an engagement, you obviously see patterns within your work. And it's then, in order to save time, trying to recreate those patterns without being overloaded with with tool X giving you a spectacular list, as was described, that just sort of incorporates the usual fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So I'm just sort of wondering, how do you avoid those pitfalls? And as I sort of nervously look at the list of tools out there, both open and commercial, which one should I not waste any time on? And I don't really want an answer for that, because I'm not sure anybody really wants to, go to talk about a specific commercial tool, but it's just something I'm sort of approaching and I'm very cautious about.
I think the problem with the automated tools is they are too specific. And because they're specific, you kind of like you mentioned earlier about boiling the earth, but it's not that, it's counting grains of sand.
Well, that would be worse.
Yeah, you're much better off, rather than counting grains of sand, just concreting the beach, or using a shovel or something. You don't need to work with every single grain of sand individually. And I do a whole thing on the OWASP top 10 where I talk about using it for threat modeling, and I get it down to, I think, 4 categories to work with, one of which is injection. Now, if you consider, okay, there is the attack vector of injection, and that means anywhere I am taking in data, I need to make sure it's properly sanitized, properly escaped, properly dealt with. If you do that, thousands of those vulnerabilities vanish instantly. In the same way, pen tests, I have seen a pen test and I've seen a vulnerability scan come back and tell me there's detailed error messages. And I've seen in a pen test, every single one of those error pages be listed out individually as a separate vulnerability. It's, there's one fix for that. It's not 200 different vulnerabilities. It's one, it's turn off debug. So a lot of the time where they are getting that specific and looking at different instances, I would argue you benefit by having a human doing it first, who can take that step back and say, we can close down this whole category of attacks by just doing this. So the tools, I think, have a value, but they have a value when you have done the initial work to reduce the size of the beach.
Right.
Hopefully that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. Without all things being equal, it is a question of how you list issues appropriately and efficiently, so that you don't lose the customer, or the client in this case, in those grains of sand.
Yeah, absolutely. Or your development team.
Correct. Yes. Most important.
But what's your experience, Gareth, on that, right? Do you have what tools have you used, and what experience do you have with them?
So you're looking at a person who has not used specific tools other than diagramming tools and a content management system of some kind to document it. So it's almost, I don't want to say pencil and paper, but it's slightly more advanced pencil and paper. And having experience with a number of automated tools in a bunch of different security areas, such as source code analysis and automated black box scanning, and seeing that sea of spectacular false positives, I really hesitate to get into the automated arena. And so that's really what my ask is. But when I do my work in terms of threat modeling, whether it was an employee working with a development team or as a consultant, you do see regular patterns, and depending on how the client wants to see the data and how you perceive they want to see the data that would be the most effective to them, It's in a case of, like in the case of injection. Well, do we say in these particular flows from multiple data flow diagrams, this is your injection, refer to this element, make sure you do these things? Or will they miss that and you need to reiterate it on every freaking flow? So I'm sort of caught between that. Yes, I do see the pattern. There is these repeated things. How do we make this more efficient and then very effective?
Mm. It sounds like a lot of that depends who you're talking to.
Yeah, indeed.
If you're talking to the developers, it's a very different conversation to if you're talking to, I don't know, the project manager or the CFO.
Yeah, and it's almost like you have one threat model but 3 views.
That sounds like a very good way to put it.
Or more threats, because they will see different threats from their point of view.
Well, it's almost like the and I hate to use the word agile. I'll apologize in advance, but it's the persona, right? So I've been working coincidentally a lot in what's called design thinking from a number of different perspectives, and I'm absolutely fascinated with the persona aspect and the empathy element of design thinking. I'm thinking, like, why didn't Boeing use this, for God's sake? But it's a case of well, yeah, who is your consumer, and having an empathetic view towards how they want to see this data. The CIO or the CEO will have a sort of business risk, how do I stay out of jail kind of point of view, whereas project managers versus developers will have a very different point of view. And it's, I think you almost have, if you have one document for one project of all those threats, you almost need 3 different documents, or a document that portrays the same information, but appropriately for those particular consumers.
Well, that's why for me, like, every threat model ends up in a graph, right? Because what you were talking about is different views that you do once the data is in a way you can manipulate, right? If you manipulate the data, within context, where you then have is the ability to create those different views that you're talking about.
Yeah, as far as I know, but my knowledge is not exhaustive in this case. As far as I know, any tool that's out there, whether automatic or semi-automatic, they don't have that kind of facility.
No, they're very low level. Having said that, there's frameworks out there. If you look at MITRE or ENISA taxonomy, they do actually have those levels built in, because you've got the attack all the way up to the category. So the concepts exist, but no one's really built that into a tool yet.
Right. So you're talking about the MITRE attack framework, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, and I don't think they have a card game yet, just checking. But has anybody used attack as sort of a prime for, as a mechanism to build threat models?
I have, but only because I spent 6 months dedicated to researching and working on threat models for my dissertation. So there's very few things that could be used that I haven't used. But yeah, MITRE was one of the ones, along with ENISA taxonomy, which is very similar.
So when you mean attack, you mean like simulating the point of view of the attacker, like, or actually attack framework?
Well, from my point of view, I'm sort of thinking it is of using it as a source of ideas when building a threat model.
So use it as a threat library, and you can actually map the categories in it across to something like Stride if you feel like it. You could basically take them and use them as cards.
Yeah, so I would say that I did exactly what you described, but I think I cheated because I was basically, I was almost doing a pen test on paper.
Yeah, that's not cheating.
So in a way, I use the experience of the attacks that I have, right, and the knowledge that I have over a lot of years to basically simulate the attacks and basically the attack trees in doing the threat model. In fact, I found that that's a great way to start it. Usually, the other trick I would do is I would find a couple of vulnerabilities that I already know existed. So I had a good way to hit that punchline with the people in the room, which made the whole process a lot more easier. So you sort of guide them through a vulnerability you know exists already, but you're letting the developers or the architects and the people in the room arrive at the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Andre has a question in the chat. Is there any ISO or international standards regarding the creation of a threat model, the model itself?
I don't know of an ISO or international. The most common standard I come across is using data flow diagrams. And I suspect that's because Stride used data flow diagrams and Stride got popular. And also the idea of trust zones is a really, really good idea if it's applied properly. But I don't think there is a standard, and I don't think you could build a standard except maybe around, you could possibly do a diagramming standard, but then you're just into architectural diagrams, as we covered earlier on.
Well, it goes back to the conversation we were having this morning, right?
Yeah.
I feel that threat modeling are and again maps out of it are almost should be something that gets created from representations of something, right? Of the architecture of the application of a particular reality or particular, what was the word you used? Not reality, was
accuracy,
accuracy.
correctness.
Yeah, correctness. So I feel that and actually that's a if we actually really look at it, right, and if you start to put into context the current supply chain problems that we have, right, the fact that we don't have good ways to represent architecture and good ways to represent models that you can verify and you can basically look at it and go, and this is sound, is a massive problem, right? Because one of the best analysis that I saw on the SolarWinds attack, right, was actually done by, I think it was Reversing Labs. And what they were doing is they were basically saying the way we can detect this is by starting to map or at least visualize the capabilities of a bit of code, right? And then what was very interesting is that you went from a DLL that barely, didn't do much, right? Some business logic, some initialization things, to suddenly a DLL that could talk to the network, could make internal stuff, could save things, could read processes. So there's a huge amount of stuff that, if you think about it, if you're doing a threat model of an application, those are all things that should be there, right? Like in a way, a tool's ability to read the processes that are running, the tool's ability to go to the internet, all of those are capabilities that you have to model because they could be abused, they could be badly implemented, they could have all sorts of threats. So I always felt that threat model are a great way to start to create common almost standards and common patterns that we can use to validate security of applications, or at least even or modules, and even just draw a line in the sand. Because if you think about it, a vulnerability is when you have an unintended side effect, right? So if you have a function that is supposed to hit the network and do a certain things, well, that's a feature, right? And as long as the people buying it understand that this thing has remote code execution as a feature, or is supposed to be logging into other devices and executing commands, or is supposed to go to the internet and auto-update itself, then that's okay, right? That should actually be part of the threat model that you accept when you install a tool, right? And I actually feel that those patterns, right, those almost diagrams and those architectures are a good first step, or a good step in forcing every provider to provide architecture that basically information about how it works. And even for the cases where somebody would make the business case to say, we're not going to share our source code, right? Because, we don't want to. But even if they share, right? Like the reality is that, reviewing the source code, right? It's also quite impossible, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, we've had vulnerabilities in open source systems for sitting there for years.
Yeah.
So.
This is where, look, the thing that, is also quite, social shows that sometimes a good solution when it comes at the wrong time doesn't work, or there's not enough energy, right? So Microsoft, actually the JVM, they developed this thing called code access security, which was actually a really good idea, right? Was this idea that you give privileges to the code to do what you want it to do in a specific context. So it doesn't matter if the code actually has the capability to do X, you give it like a policy, right? And that policy gets enforced at runtime. And it's kind of what some of the mobile apps do these days with the sandboxing and all that stuff. But I found that is a great way to scale, because that again is describing known good. It's describing what you want to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, threat models should again represent that. So you can have a threat model that says, I can do all this stuff. And then you can say, well, if the environment doesn't allow you to do that, then you are in a good place. So you start to eliminate categories of threats based on where you actually are running this. The problem is we tend to run this in very high privilege environments. They can do just about most everything.
I have a different question. Somehow you made me think, how do you tie incidents to the threat modeling? Like if you are building a similar system to what you have now, and the incidents type of, not just security incidents, all the incidents, how can you use that as intelligence to inform your threat modeling?
Well, that should be one of the major sources of data, right? So
it's your feedback loop.
Yeah, look, I would argue that, when you calculate the impact, right, your probability, right, is basically the number of incidents over time. Within a period of time, you as a company, right, should have that data, right? It is kind of that simple, right? Like, if you don't have the data, then either you're not paying attention, right, or it's not happening.
And so are you using that as a resource?
Getting there. We're about to do a big SOC 2 project where we're going to do a whole massive risk. In fact, that's the next Open Security Summit session about scaling, SOC 2 using Jira. And that's exactly one of the things that I want to put in there, right? When we do risk assessment, the data from risk, from incidents, and basically what happened and how you handle should be fitting your threats and your and your decisions, right?
Yeah, your risk management overall.
Yeah, because apart from a couple of major things that you can say, well, we never had one of these, but they are quite risky, right? A lot of the other things, if you have a good incident response team and they have a low threshold, i.e. they keep responding quite effectively, you should have data, right? You should have good data that tells you where you're having security incidents versus where you're not having.
Even if they have quite a high threshold, if they're responding badly, you should have data if you've had an incident.
Yeah, correct.
But then there's a question, because let's take it one further. If you're doing instant response scenarios, if you're doing that type of testing, is there any reason that couldn't feed back into your threat models as well?
Yeah. Basically, in one you're saying there is this bad thing happened, and in one you're saying what if, or what bad can happen.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think those, if you think about it, those simulations are super powerful, because it basically allows you to almost ask the question, what would happen here? Right?
I'm wondering how different it is from just a very focused threat modeling exercise.
Well, not at all, because that should fit into your threat model, right?
It should, but what I'm saying is, with some of because we've done some of those instant response scenarios, it's almost picking one attack from the threat model and saying, right, let's fully explore that one.
You're reactive and you're trying to fix something rather than build something better. Maybe you can do the building side after you fix the stuff.
Yeah, and as Andres pointed out, it's got huge overlap with use, misuse, and abuse cases.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. But I think that those are the things that eventually, as you do more and more threat models, right, that's how you scale, right? That's how you find blind spots, right? Like in a way, when you do, if you think about it, like when you run a scenario, your threat model should already have answered some of the questions, right? Because the threat model should have asked that. You should have then accepted the risks of the stuff that you're not going to do, so that when you simulate that on the scenario, you should say, well, we're not doing this because we got that in place, or okay, we know that, and then that would be a problem because of this.
Yep.
But those attack trees and those scenarios are, I think, are super powerful, and I feel that that's as the threat modeling, practice matures, I feel that's that where it becomes super useful, because you keep, you keep just challenging your assumptions, right? You keep challenging your categories, right, of what you got here, right? And you then, and also it's interesting to see, like, when something on the industry occurs, let's say, like now, third-party vendor due diligence, right, or third-party DLLs that you inject in your application, as for example, what everybody does with freaking NuGet or NPMs and all the dependency checks, right? The question to ask is, how does that fit within your threat model?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example, right? So for me, one of the answers that we would give is that our platform, we're building so much detection, right, within where we run our code. So the question is, I almost feel like we can't prevent some of the injections, right? Especially on some of the modules, but you can make sure that if something in that environment tries to connect out, or something in that environment tries to do something that your code doesn't do, then you can pick it up. And I feel that that's one of the ways to scale this, is not to say I need all the code on my application to be secure 100%, is I need to understand very clearly what my code is doing, so that any deviation from that raises an alarm.
Then, of course, you're getting into the security by controlling interfaces and component architecture way of doing things, which works. And sadly, we moved away from that with hardware many, many years ago. But it did work while it lasted.
But you still get it there. Like, if you think about it, like, if you understand the connections and the flows of traffic and the behavior of an application, and why is it very effective to protect your assets, right? Like, one of the techniques is, if you can only monitor a couple of things, monitor your assets, because that's what's going to be attacked. And if you see anybody connected to your assets that it's not what you recognize, then something is wrong, right? Yep. So that scales, right? The problem is, in most organizations, that engineering capability, or that the ability to monitor that is not taken as seriously as the next UI feature and the next development. The irony, right, is that, and this is something I really would like to prove with data, and threat modeling, I think, will help us to do that. Is my argument is that the same way that you can now prove that DevOps makes apps better, right? Good DevOps practices allows you to ship code faster, to have better code, to have more secure code, to actually, the fact that you can push a feature quickly to production is not just that speed, is everything else that it also enables. I would also argue that this visibility that we need from a security point of view would also improve the quality and the resilience of the product itself.
Well, is there any reason you couldn't threat model bugs?
Mm-hmm.
Frankly,
there isn't, because threat modeling is about asking again what can go wrong, right?
Yeah, I've managed now to get someone to threat model a policy framework, which I was really happy with. Yeah. I'm still trying to find a marketing campaign who'll allow threat modeling
during security incidents, right? because the great thing of a bug or a security incident is that the question of this would never happen has already been answered, right?
Yeah, but there's another step, which is what could happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a mistake we tend to do a lot, is that we don't look at the next steps. We look at sometimes what happens, and we don't say, well, did the next steps didn't happen because you had mitigation in place, or you were just lucky that the attacker turned left instead of turning right.
I'm sorry, how do you threat model a bug?
It's just another attack, effectively. It's another attack vector. It's another thing that could go wrong.
Okay, so bug as your not as your system or the thing that the asset is not the bug. You're using it in the threat modeling exercise.
Yeah, you're saying it is availability is part of security. If we take CIA, a bug, a service failure is a threat. A crash on an invalid input, whether that's deliberate or not. A lot of the time we separate, well, if it's deliberate, it's a security incident, and if it's not deliberate, it's an operational incident. Does it really matter? Can't we just treat them as one thing?
Yeah. Look, you do a data flow diagram, right? You map the assets, and then you say, well, this went wrong, right? So immediately you might be an availability problem, but it could be, could be a data corruption, right? It could be all sorts of other things, right? But then what I think is interesting is then you follow the threat model and you find the root causes of it. So you might find, for example, that the root cause is a problem in QA. You might find that the root cause is a problem in a test framework. You might find that is lack of, it's a brief problem. So I always think that it's interesting to look at the secondary effects, because the secondary effects also allows you to find all sorts of other things and allows you to say, this is a one-off thing. So for example, there's a massive difference between a one-off bug and a systemic bug, right? And you might have a systemic bug being invoked once or twice as a trickle, so you might not feel like it's a systemic bug, but actually, if you look at the root cause of it, right, you have that. Now, it's easier to do this for security because security, in most cases, is a bug, right?
Yep.
But there's no reason. I actually think it's a failure of the threat modeling workflow that, in a way, we haven't even solved it for security, which is such an obvious path. But I see that once we solve it for security, the natural progression is to start to map it for architecture, for bugs, for multiple paths that you can go. So you allow you to make good decisions. And security is just a subset of that. But threat modeling is a great concept because it tends to be stronger than a bug, right? A bug, you almost can get away with it by fixing it. And once you fix the bug, the energy that exists around it can go down. Where a threat model there's a bigger motivation behind it.
Lots of outcomes.
Yeah. That's why one of my party tricks, right, is to basically go to business owners and say, if you don't do a threat model, you have to accept the risk that says, you don't understand the security implications of either your application or this feature. But if you ask the same team to say, can you write documentation? Can you document what's going on? Can you write an architectural diagram? Everybody says, really cool, we really like it. Go to the back of the queue, right?
So are we talking about security people trying to do threat models turning into essentially the business analyst who goes around, discovers everything, documents it, and makes sure everyone knows it?
I think that's a very valuable function for the security team that should be funded, that is actually very cost effective.
And arguably it does fall under security, it's information integrity.
Yeah. Well, look, security is one of the few teams that can talk to everybody, right? So if you play your cards right, you have the scope to do this.
Yeah.
Where other teams,
I can vouch for that. Having used this in order to talk to everyone and get some documentation that didn't exist, yes, it does work. So long as the politics are right for you to get away with it.
I had one new hire when I used to work at a particular company come to me and thank me for my threat models because it was the only architectural documentation they had.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Which was both nice and scary at the same time.
I've seen the same thing come out of vulnerability scans, actually, it being the only network map that exists.
But you know that, right? When you ask somebody to explain, their environment, and they pull the pen and start drawing, right?
Mm.
I almost feel like there's your first risk.
No documentation.
But that's this is why our industry and its software industry is so insane, because if you go outside software, the idea that you don't have architects, the idea it's diagrams and flows and how it works, it's insane, right? But in software, we still get away with it, right?
So I don't know, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think the software industry is in turmoil and doesn't realize it yet.
Well, I think it's been in turmoil for the last 10 years, man. But the problem is it still get away with it. And there is still not enough. It's an economic problem, right? There's still not enough business pressure to do the right thing.
I disagree. It's not been in turmoil for the last 10 years. It's been in turmoil facing these exact same problems since 1972 when the first report on them was written.
Fair enough. Don't argue with that, right? But it's economic problem, right? Like it's an economic problem that, was maybe reasonably benign when systems was, not mission critical. But now that they become mission critical, we still implement large systems with engineering practices that outside software would be considered insane. In fact, in most professionals, if they run hospitals the way we run software, we were looking and going, this is a 18th century hospital.
Or right? In the case of Boeing, the 737 MAX.
Well, yeah, correct. The thing about this is that we still haven't had a sequence of events that, in a way, look, if you look at what happened with pollution, right? And if you look at what happened with car safety and all those things, look, it took a number of deaths, right, for those industry to change, right? And in a weird way, the software industry, because I think from a combination of sometimes the attackers don't know what they're doing, sometimes the attackers have a business model that is not based on destruction, the companies impacted have a lot of advantages in hiding the reality of it, right? There's not a lot of good standards to talk about. And the problem is so freaking complex that nobody has a decent solution. It just moves on, right? But we've been doing that. Look, since I've been in security, we've been moving that, every year, right? It's just, you just move it under the rug, right? So look, for example, like the SolarWinds exploit, if the companies that were impacted were forced to provide an accurate description of what the attackers could have done with that exploit, the industry would have changed. Because the impact of that, the problem is that we always talk about, yeah, but the attackers didn't do this. We have no evidence that was exploited. It's almost like we depend on the business model of the attackers to define our ceilings today.
Which is one thing that makes the SolarWinds one interesting, because normally the business model of the attackers is pure profit. It's ransomware, it's theft of information. Yeah. With the SolarWinds one, that was not the motive, and therefore it becomes a lot harder to predict what they might have done. So all of these flat networks, flat networks doesn't matter. You're talking about admin access to everything anyway.
Yeah, but that's you can still do that threat model, right? That's the threat model that you can do. You can say, if I have admin there, how about we get? And the reality is, right? Like, I've done a couple of these, right? Sometimes it's not as bad as you would think, right? There is checks and balances, right? There's things where people will pull the plug, right? Like this idea again that you can just go in there and raise havoc left, right, and center. It's not like that. But there is a lot of things that we should know, right?
Well, there's also all of the obstacles that prevent efficient management of the systems. They work both ways.
Oh, absolutely. the fact that companies don't understand how the thing works, right? Sometimes it's, it's like
the attacker doesn't magically know better than the company.
Exactly, right? But and the thing I like about this, right, about threat modeling is that if companies were forced to publish their threat models, right? If companies had the same way they disclose their accounts, they disclose their threat models, right? You would know very clearly what's going on, right? You can tell very clearly which company has a clue, which company doesn't have a clue, right? You give me 5 threat models from 5 different companies, I tell you straight away which one has a good security team, which one understands what they're doing, which one understands the problem, which one has no clue.
I
It's
agree.
actually a great idea.
Right?
It is, but the thing I see here is that when you say force, are we talking, and it may be a combination of multiple things, but the first one I see is potential legislation and the balance of legislation across.
Oh, absolutely. It has to be regulation, because the companies are not going to go there, because this is in the short term is voting against your own interests. It's only the companies who do it well that can play this game well.
Well, if we follow the car safety metaphor, then it's a case of, yeah, you can build your car, but you just can't sell it here. So you can build your software, but you cannot sell it in this jurisdiction. The cloud will be an open idea there, but we'd have to talk about that. But if you want to be able to sell that piece of software or have people from a jurisdiction be able to consume that piece of software, then you need to meet these security criteria, and there has to be some form of international consistency.
I'm not sure it even needs legislation, though. If you got every insurance company to say, you know what, we want to see every customer's threat model, publish your threat model or you can't get cyber insurance, or give us your threat model or you can't get cyber insurance. If we don't think it's realistic, your premium goes sky high, or it's invalidated.
Yeah, but it would still if they publish, right, to the insurance company, the impact would still be limited.
It would be limited, but it forces them to do the threat model. By doing a threat model, you're measuring it. It will make a huge difference, because it just gives that visibility. It doesn't have to start with legislation. That could be an end goal, but it's just an insurance company saying, yeah, okay, we'll insure you, but we want your threat model.
Well, look, I remember several times, every time I meet an insurance person, right, I talk to them and say, hey, cool, when you guys are going to set up a really good security team to evaluate the profile of your companies, right? And the guys were like, well, we're lawyers, we don't do security. I'm like, oh, there you go. Let's talk next year, right? Because, the reality is that, you're right, the cybersecurity companies are missing a massive trick, right? Because they should have one of the best cybersecurity teams in the planet, because they should be using that as a way to measure premiums.
They could become an authority.
They should, yeah. They could. Well, they will, right? Because the question is whether they are part of the ones that develop the standards, or they just be one of the users of the standards.
Or enforcers.
Right? Well, once there's a standard, they can enforce it, right? Because then it's easy, right? Once there's a way to measure this, right? Then they'll say, we won't insure you unless you do this, right? And it's kind of a way you can see it's happening is, for example, the third-party verification standards, right? So the third-party compliance stuff, right? In fact, that's the session that I want to do, right? Where, so we're going to be doing a bit of work on how to scale SOC 2. And the problem is, at the moment, that there doesn't seem to be a good way to scale it, right? There doesn't seem to be, where's the graph that I can just, consume and say, I'm going to plug my bits over here, and then this is going to translate it into that and that scenario. Right, but that's what you need, right? Because that's, how you can scale this. Actually going back, Garrett, to that concept, right? You need to be able to take the data and present it in multiple lenses to multiple audiences, or else the complexity of the systems, is, if you run these on spreadsheets, right, or whatever, right, it doesn't scale because the complexity of this is too much.
So we need augmented reality for threat modeling.
Well,
I don't know if we need it, but I want augmented reality for threat modeling now.
Well, no, that's a good example, right? Like that you could evolve into it. You could see that, that is just a nice way to consume lots of data, right?
I'm just picturing building a threat model with the full minority report interface.
Well, but that's exactly where we need to get to, man. But the interesting part of here is that you won't solve that until you solve the problem of how does the company work?
Well,
what technology is there?
Yeah, you need, what you need to solve it is the underlying modeling language for a company.
Yeah. But it's doable once the economic model is aligned. Because then you can get around it.
It's doable now without the economic model. I mean, the whole thing I keep on saying about modeling a policy framework, it's a series of entities which relate to each other and have inputs and outputs.
Oh yeah, no, it's doable now, and I think it's whoever can help. I think we're trying to move that needle forward right now. If you look at the threat modeling community, it's a community that's trying to make this happen, right? But we haven't solved it. Is how to make it scale. So we don't. In a way, the problem with regulation today is that if any regulation comes out now, it will be a really bad regulation because there isn't something that the regulation can go and say, I want that one public and measure it over here and go.
I think abstraction layers are going to be a huge part of that.
Yeah.
Being able to just say, okay, I'm talking about a single service running on a cluster in the cloud, or I'm talking about a business department. And if you can use the same language to describe both of those, you're on the right track.
Yeah. See, I thought that we were going to get there when the cloud guys became really big, because I thought the cloud guys have an incentive to give us visibility until they start to make too much money with people not understanding what was going on. And then you're back to the same problem. The same way that, Microsoft could have solved this problem, but Microsoft made a lot of money, right, by complexity. So then
it's also they've not got. It's not purely we make money by no one understanding this. It's also we don't really understand this, and it would cost money and effort to understand it.
Yep. But this is the kind of thing that we say in our industry that we almost are too blasé about it, but it's a shocking revelation, right? To go to a company and say, do you understand how the platform that runs, and forget about Microsoft, like most companies, you go, do you understand how the thing that powers your business actually works, right? And in most cases, the answer is no. There's some code over there that always works. Do the people who wrote that code still in the building? No. Is there good documentation? No.
Yeah, probably any company over a few dozen people, you're going to hit that.
Well, my experience is that it's been like throughout the entire organization, right down to the developers using that code and not really understanding they know enough to make things work, but not enough to understand the ramifications of what they were doing.
And if you look at the scalability of threat model at that level is that you should have these chained threat models that represent the behavior of the applications. So threat models actually are great abstractions for understanding how something works. And because it also allows you to create boxes where you say, I don't care if I don't know how that works, because at the moment, all I need to understand is the behavior of that. And I contain the behavior like this. So it goes almost back to your categorizations, right? Which is until we have that defined, right? This is going to be really hard to pull off. And it's more art than science.
Yeah.
The problem is these things now run the planet, right? And every company is a software company.
It's fine. I'm sure at some point we'll just take a few years out to finally take stock of all this.
Yeah. Because imagine, if the SolarWinds guys, right, the guys who attack SolarWinds, or the guys, imagine somebody compromised their command and control. If they want to do ransomware, can you imagine the impact that could have done?
I'm honestly surprised that attack did not end with massive ransomware.
Because whoever did that most likely wants to stay within the threat intelligence level.
Yeah, so they've made a deliberate choice not to cause even targeted disruption.
Correct. And the other thing that's interesting about that is to see that if you see the stock price of FireEye, and the stock price of SolarWinds is interesting because the stock price of FireEye went down when they announced the first incident. But now you had something that is rare on security incidents. You had a company which knows what they're doing, has security expertise, and is now commercially motivated to share it. Because, and you can see what happens, right? They did the right business decision because, you know, they share a lot of information, and guess what happened? They got a lot of business, and well, I don't know, probably, but the share price went high a lot because they actually were motivated to share about it. Most of the other players are not that motivated to share what's going on.
Well, typically, based on previous data, like Ponemon data, the cost of a breach per account is actually less if you wait for a full forensic analysis. Whereas if, okay, we got to pay people off without really understanding the scope and issues of the breach, the average cost per account is much higher.
Right. Yep. One of the things that and this is where I go, that I think that threat models should have to be disclosed, is because you want to create a commercial model that rewards understanding and rewards the saying that if you start to lie today, eventually you will catch up. Because eventually you're going to say, you know, how come you didn't know about this, you know, 3 months ago or 5 months ago? So a good example is, where is the threat modeling of the companies impacted by this? They should have a threat model that say, if that application is compromised, what is the blast radius?
Who knew what when?
Sorry?
Who knew what when?
Yeah, exactly, right. And this is one of the cases where if we can turn as an industry, right, the model so that you reward companies who do it well, then it becomes almost like what happened with the environment and pollution, right? A case where, you know, suddenly if you find yourself on the polluter side, you become a problem, because not just the market is punishing you with fines, the customers are punishing you with lack of business. So suddenly, to create materials that don't pollute are now not just cost effective, they also improve your top line and your bottom line. And that's what you want to do. You want, you know, one of the challenges as a CISO is always, how do I make the business case to invest in this? And a lot of times, one of the few things you have is the fear factor, right? You know, this could go wrong. But what you want is to also be able to say, look, this will decrease our premium. The insurance analogy, right? This will, you know, allow us to be more compliant with this. This will give us more business because those customers are pushing those requirements to us. So suddenly there's business case to go and look at those legacy systems that nobody understands and map them correctly. Suddenly there's business case to say, for the new software we're developing, it has to be fully documented. All the side effects have to be understood, and we have to capture it correctly. Cool. I think we should be wrapping up. Any final comments on this?
This has been awesome.
There you go. Joins for the other one, huh?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you,
All right.
guys. I'm stopping the recording.